Hey everyone, you're listening to Ankur Warikoo on Woice with Warikoo. On this podcast, I talk to you about entrepreneurship, how to grow in life, manage personal finances, handle failures, and a lot more things that just come to my mind. The episode begins. This podcast is inspired by a wonderful thread that a friend of mine, Shreyas Doshi, who is a fantastic product manager and a very experienced leader based out of the US, he'd written a thread about this. And when I read it, it was reminding me of something that I'd consumed several years back, but had forgotten. And this thread was just a wonderful reaffirmation of all those beliefs that just came rushing by. And I wanted to share with all of you. Very often, we would find ourselves in situations where we think we're doing a lot of work, but it may not be in the right direction. And I'm not going to theorize this by using a fancy term or anything, but I'm going to attempt explaining this through an example. Imagine that you are the captain of the ship Titanic. And suddenly you get this message that we are facing an iceberg. And if we don't do anything, we're going to run into it, and most likely that'll be disastrous. So what you do is, oh my God, you suddenly start sharing the ship and you do everything that you can. And just in the nick of time, the ship suddenly goes and strikes the iceberg. Barely, but enough to make damage happen. And now the ship is sinking and you have to save those people. So you start getting those lifeboats out. You start putting people on those lifeboats. You have these beautiful musicians who are playing, trying to calm people down. You are making things happen. You know that people will lose their lives, but you also know that your responsibility is to save lives, and you'll go about doing that. And in the end, which is different from what actually happened at the Titanic, you also end up saving yourself. And once all of that is over, once that entire episode is done and dusted with, you suddenly made a hero. The world looks at you and goes, oh my God, here's the captain of the ship Titanic who had thousands of people on board and still managed to save hundreds of lives because he was absolutely on the job. You suddenly call for press conferences. You are covered in magazines and newspapers, on national television. People reach out to you and invite you now for motivational conversations, for leadership lessons. You are basically the person who made this thing happen. Now imagine another captain of another ship. And let's call that ship also Titanic. And suddenly the captain is made aware that they are running into an iceberg. And they're like, oh my God, we have to do something, otherwise we lose lives. And the captain does everything that it can to make it happen. And they are able to save the ship from striking the iceberg. And that suddenly jolts the captain. The captain's like, oh my God, that was such a close shave. And I have to ensure that I never get myself into this spot. So now I'm going to be a lot more diligent, a lot more discerning, a lot more proactive in my approach. Make sure that we don't make any mistakes. Make sure that we are always aware of the weather conditions, of what's ahead of us. Make sure that we have deployed the right people. I'm going to do everything possible to prevent a mishap like this happening ever again in my life. I don't want to be looking at this again. And this captain goes through decades of that experience. The captain retires with an impeccable safety record, not even a single strike. Nobody lost their life. But, you know what happened? This captain is not a hero. This captain will never be featured on magazines and newspapers, on national television, will rarely be invited for any talk around motivation, around crisis management, around leadership. This person, as much as will be respected, will never ever get the reputation of the saver. And that is the irony of life. If you are a preventer, if you work hard towards preventing mishaps from happening, if you work hard diligently to ensure that your work is absolutely impeccable, without flaws, done in a manner that is so robust, you will essentially do something that will never get as acknowledged as somebody who built something which perhaps was flawed and then saved the context or the situation from failing. Because a savior will always be heralded a lot more than the preventer. The savior will be acknowledged as the warrior, as against the preventer, who will just be rewarded as a diligent worker. And now, what happens then in real life is that we're suddenly incentivized to save, not to prevent, but to save. Perhaps not even realizing it ourselves. Put ourselves into a spot where we are making mistakes so that we can save ourselves from the mistakes and suddenly emerge from it as victorious. I don't know how many of you have felt this in your life. I have often, when I was young, wished that I went through a physical handicap and then emerged out of it so that I could show to the world how strong I was. Today, I find that foolish. I'm like, who the hell was I? What was I thinking? What was wrong with me? Because why would I want to lose a leg and then stand up on stage showing how I made it in life without losing anything except my leg? I don't want to do that. I love my leg. I love my hands. I love my eyes. I love my body. I love my mind. And I don't want to go through a failure and then save myself from that failure to make sure that I am heralded a hero. But we all make that mistake. Subconsciously, we all do. And the point of this episode was to sensitize you to that, to hopefully make you aware that you may find yourself in situations where you want things to fail so that you can save it and then come across as the savior, as against do the right thing, which is to prevent mistakes from happening in the first place, prevent damage from happening in the first place, prevent failure from happening in the first place. And if you do that with the realization and the awareness that you perhaps will not be acknowledged as much as the one who saves the world, but it'll still be the right thing to do. All the best. Thank you for listening to this episode of Woice with Warikoo. To be notified of upcoming episodes, be sure to subscribe and follow the show on this app right now. Also, don't forget to rate and review the show because that just feels nice. Thank you.